All right, I hope you folks are ready for this one. Let's do our fourth episode of Did Syd, or Did Syd Barrett. And in this episode, we're going to tackle the topic of Did Syd Barrett Led Zeppelin IV? Now, if you're familiar with the series, you know already what we like to do, or what I'm going to try to do, is just draw out as many connections as I can between Mr. Barrett and the album itself. You can decide whether or not you think he had a hand in the development of the album in some way, or if it's just an influence, perhaps in the way Mr. Barrett started or changed the way that music was presented. And you can go through and look at all that and make up your own mind. But I'm going to go through Led Zeppelin IV, which is a very strange album, and quite appropriately enough, it wasn't really given a name, so we're not going to give this a name of episode 4. We're just going to ask, did Syd Barrett Led Zeppelin IV? So if you're familiar with the series and the Peeling Syd Barrett series, you know one of the things I like to do is call out any kinds of corrections from previous episodes. And this Did Syd series and Peeling Syd Barrett series I'm going to keep separate, I think, from now on. So what I'm going to try to do, at least as far as corrections are concerned, I'm just going to discuss corrections tied to that series, because I don't know if people are going back and forth between the two series. So Did Syd Julia Dream is an older one, and I was thinking through it, as I tend to do over time, and I realized at some point that the lyrics to Did Syd Julia Dream by Pink Floyd was kind of the discussion about that very specific lyric of a scaly armadillo. So, will the scaly armadillo find me where I'm hiding? And we discussed how scaly armadillo could be a reference to an older man, and the various reasons why symbolically that could be appropriate. And I would just like to point out, of course, that this therefore could be a song that was written in memory of an adolescent relationship, or perhaps was even written during the course of that adolescent relationship. And that's important for a few reasons, one of which is, of course, if it was written while a person was relatively young, you have to wonder then who wrote it. I know that Mr. Barrett, of course, had a relationship when he was very young. I don't know about Mr. Waters. I assume he did as well. It's, of course, accredited in writing to Mr. Waters, but was he having some kind of clandestine, moonlit relations with a certain someone, and an older male, i.e. a father, possibly didn't approve? I don't know. But it is possible, I suppose, that could be appropriate to Mr. Barrett's life. So we have to wonder then also if there is a statement of a Velvet Bride, if there wasn't also some kind of a mention of, or an oath or a promise to eventually become married in some way. And of course, there's no way of knowing how seriously people take that type of a statement when they're young. It's very easy, especially when you're dealing with someone that's kind of on the an up-and-comer, that perhaps they're just saying what's convenient at the time, but it's very difficult to know what's in someone's mind or in their heart. So sometimes, of course, someone can make a promise and absolutely intend to keep it. And of course, some people make promises all the time that they never intend to keep. You have to kind of judge the character of the individual at that time. The point is that there may have been a promise that was made at that time by someone, if you believe that the song is actually autobiographical in some way, that was related to a promise to be with someone for a long period of time. And perhaps that didn't really happen. You also have to wonder, of course, why was that single being made after Mr. Barrett was kind of gone already? It's a little bit odd. If that was something that you believe that Mr. Barrett perhaps wrote, why is that being released in that way? Anyway, that's just a question. So let's go ahead. We're going to move on. There's a whole lot of material to cover for Led Zeppelin IV. I have specifically chosen this album because this is the one that I have the most questions about. And oddly enough, the songs that I've heard, and by the way, I'm a big Led Zeppelin fan, of course. Most people, I think, are, that love music from the 60s, the late 60s in particular. I'm going to ask a number of questions, and we're going to try to figure out why it is that this album is so unique, and also perhaps does that uniqueness perhaps lend itself in some way to the uniqueness of Mr. Barrett. Now, let's do a little background really quick. First off, I would like to point out that Led Zeppelin, of course, was put together with what many people would consider now to be three of the greatest contributors to rock and roll music in the history of rock and roll. Of course, Robert Plant, who's considered by many to be one of the, if not the greatest vocalist in all of all time in rock and roll. Mr. John Bonham, who of course many people consider to be the greatest rock and roll drummer of all time. Personally, I don't know if I believe that. I do really like Mr. Bonham, but I'm more partial to Keith Moon. And of course, what many people consider to be one of the greatest guitarists in rock and roll history, which is Jimmy Page. Now, Jimmy Page had a very odd type of delivery, and perhaps he wasn't what you would consider to be a really flashy guitarist, I suppose. But he was definitely able to come up with some really experimental and strange sounds on the guitar that other people were not able to. And of course, as we previously mentioned, that's something that Mr. Barrett also was capable of doing. So we know that for a time anyway, Mr. Barrett was out of work and was developing his own music and somewhat working with, particularly with Mr. David Gilmour. And one of the stories that I find quite interesting is a story from Mr. Julian Palacios's book, and Dark Globe. And within that book, he discusses the idea of Mr. Barrett wanting to work with The Who and Peter Townshend, and this is on page 321. Now, this is after Pink Floyd had kind of broken up. Now, this man, who everyone is saying is schizophrenic and crazy, makes this long kind of crazy drive out to see The Who at a gig in hopes that they will want to work with him, because apparently he heard that Pete Townshend really enjoyed Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Now, whether or not he ever did that, I don't know. Whether or not he ever worked with The Who, I don't know. Perhaps we'll deal with that another time. But it is obvious that he was at least considering working with other people at that time. So, one of the questions that we kind of have to ask, sorry, I have a lot of pages here to kind of read through. One of the questions that we have to kind of ask is it possible that he would have hooked up with Led Zeppelin, and are there any kind of indicators that maybe Led Zeppelin would have been receptive to working with him? Now, I swear I've read somewhere that Jimmy Page had wanted to work with Mr. Barrett, but I haven't been able to locate that yet. If I can find it, I'll throw it in here now. There are videos that I'm going to throw at you, and I'll kind of piece together the basics of that. But if you want to go through and verify them, you can go ahead and do so. Now, one of the things that I really want to point out is that in the documentary Dazed and Confused, about 6.5 minutes into that video, you can see a guitar with mirrors attached to it, and that belongs to Jimmy Page. Now, the reason that is interesting is because that is the same idea that Syd Barrett used on his guitar of attaching these circular mirrors. Now, I'll kind of put the two images up here on the screen for you to take a look at. You can see that the mirror positions don't match, so I don't think it's the same guitar. But why is Jimmy Page doing something that Mr. Barrett also was doing? Now, you could say, I guess, that perhaps Mr. Page was doing it before Syd Barrett, but I really don't believe that that's possible. Mr. Barrett was doing that in late 66 and early 67, so that would be a little bit of a surprise, I think. Now, I'm going to go ahead and ask another question to something that we've kind of been discussing before, which is, or I've alluded to before, which is the use of a bow on a guitar. Now, Jimmy Page, of course, did quite, I guess you could say, quite famously do this for, I can't remember the name of the song now, but anyway, I'm on the spot. So there is a video of Roger Waters using a bow on his guitar, on his bass guitar, in the video Scarecrow, and that was tied to some kind of a Belgian release of a video, and he's kind of just tapping on it. But why with a bow? You know, whose idea was that? And who else, of course, has come up with that idea before? Now, obviously, I would say that quite a few people probably have used bow on a guitar. I really doubt that Jimmy Page was the first person ever to dream of using a bow on a guitar, but perhaps he did kind of make it somewhat famous. So that's one of the questions that I have then. If you note those two things, one, the mirrored guitar, and two, the bow on the guitar, is there some form of an influence that's happening there between Mr. Barrett and Mr. Page? Now, I will also point out something that's quite interesting about those two men, which is that Jimmy Page was born on 9th of January 44, and Syd was born on 6th of January 46. Now, I believe this makes both of them Capricorn, and I'm not totally sure. I forget when exactly Capricorn, and I'll put it up here anyway. But Capricorn, I believe, is ruled by Saturn, or is tied to Saturn at any rate. So there's a reference to Saturn, which of course was in Astronomy Domine for Mr. Barrett in his lyrics. Why is that interesting? Well, I'll get back to that later, but obviously early January birth for both of those two guys is another kind of a strange coincidence. And if you're into astrology, and I'm not entirely into astrology, but a lot of people are, and there are indicators that perhaps Mr. Barrett was into astrology, then at least he would have had some interest in that topic. Now, Mr. Page, of course, is famously into quite a bit of esoteric reading. He's on the record saying that he did, for a time anyway, quite enjoy esoteric reading. There is a very famous book, and I'll kind of put it up here. It's written by Groupie and Pamela DeBar. And let me see what information I can give you on this book. Pamela DeBar is, I don't know, she seems all right to me. I don't know that she doesn't seem overly intellectual, but she does seem like a fairly good person. Copyright 1987. Chicago Review Press Incorporated, Chicago, Illinois. I'm with the band Confessions of a Groupie by Pamela DeBar. Now, the reason I bring up this book is, of course, that she herself claims to have had somewhat of an extended relationship with Jimmy Page. And she does outline kind of trying to get some Aleister Crowley related book material. This is on page 181. And she goes ahead and does that for him. She also outlines on page 200 to 201 some kind of strange interactions with another individual that are esoteric related, and I won't get into that too much. I just want to focus on Jimmy Page. So one of the things that Pamela DeBar kind of points out in her book is, in my opinion anyway, that Jimmy Page was always pretty gentlemanly to her, and perhaps wasn't overly, let's say, dedicated or affectionate, but he certainly didn't seem to be mean-spirited in any way. So that's an interesting characteristic to kind of keep note of as we continue to discuss these things. Now, of course, Jimmy Page also famously, after Mr. Bonham passed away, was kind of the one that said that, okay, that's it, the group's kind of done, which is, I would say, quite an honorable thing to do, in my opinion. So that's another characteristic, perhaps, of Mr. Page, is kind of a loyalty to friends. So let's take a note of that as well. Now, there are some other videos that I'm going to kind of point to, and I'm not going to totally get into them right now. What I just want to do right now is call them out and give basic ideas, and we're going to come back to them over time. The first video that I'll suggest is a BBC News interview about Stairway to Heaven. And in that, about 3 minutes in, is kind of a very vague statement about lyrics being 90% done already, and not really saying who had done the lyrics. You can check out that interview if you want. Now, the lyrics themselves were attributed to Mr. Robert Plant, of course. Now, what percent of them were done and which lines were done, I don't know. I've never seen anything that specifically says who wrote exactly what and what percentage was done by who. But there's a statement there that 90% of the lyrics were done. Now, I'll also point to a Steve, I believe, Markham discussion about occult symbolism, and he discusses the various occult symbols that are used on the album itself. And you can go ahead and check that out if you like. I won't discuss it too much here, but I will get into it a little bit more later on, the same way that we'll go into Stairway to Heaven a little bit more later on as well. Finally, I will point to an Oliver Patrick, I believe, Logman, Golden Dawn, I'm not exactly sure. Golden Dawn Research, I don't know. I'll put the information for that link here. And in that interview, Jimmy Page basically is answering a question about whether or not Stairway to Heaven contains a portion that was written backwards. And he answers that it's hard enough to write things forward, so no, he doesn't really think that there's intended things in there to be understood backwards. Now, of course, if you're familiar with Stairway to Heaven at all, you'll recognize that there is kind of this, I don't know if it's just fan-based or what, this kind of a conspiracy theory, I guess, that there are aspects to Stairway to Heaven that are, at least in the words, written backwards. Now, of course, Jimmy Page supposedly didn't write the lyrics, so even if that was in there, he wouldn't know, right? That would be a question for Robert Plant. So it's interesting that he even answers that question. He should say, you would think, right? If he didn't write the lyrics, he should say, I really don't know. I didn't write the lyrics, correct? So let's go through this process. We're going to have a lot of critical questions. If we haven't had critical thought or critical questions before about these, let's try and have it now and ask some questions that perhaps are a little bit difficult to ask, especially if you're a fan, because it's really, really, I guess it's really fun to just kind of think, well, it's all just happenstance, or it's all just luck, and of course it's also just talent. And I don't think anyone would dispute these three guys. And of course, John Paul Jones, who was very good at putting together aspects, I would say, side aspects to music that are really cool. And of course, he is the one that came up with the idea, supposedly, of adding the recorders to the beginning of the three-part song, Stairway to Heaven. So that's a lot of material there. And I'll just say, let's go ahead then, and we'll answer some of these questions kind of as we go through things. Now, the first thing that I want to discuss is the album design itself. Okay, so let's just go through the album design and note some of the things that are kind of called out, or things that I'm going to call out now. And this, of course, is all kind of addressed in Steve Markham's Occult Symbolism video on this. Now, he discusses a number of symbols that are tied to this album design, or that were initially released with the album itself. One of them is, of course, the card of the Hermit, and how the card of the Hermit in the Rider-Waite Tarot deck looks very similar to the Hermit as it's presented in this album. So I'm going to go ahead and give you what is the definition, or what are the traits of that card. Prudence, also and especially treason, dissimulation, corruption, and roguery. So those are the aspects of that card that are tied to this album for some reason. Why would prudence be tied to this album? Why would treason be tied to this album? And why would roguery and corruption be tied to this album? Now, there are reasons, of course, why this makes me think of Mr. Barrett. And I think you should as well. Who is a hermit? Assuming that someone's affiliating themselves with the card the Hermit, who is a hermit in Led Zeppelin? Perhaps Jimmy Page, I don't know. He seems like a fairly reserved individual, so perhaps it's just Jimmy Page. But I know Syd Barrett was a hermit, and he had started to become a hermit even while he was playing still with Pink Floyd. In other words, he would, go to rooms by himself and just kind of chill out and want to be away from people. So I know that's an aspect of Mr. Barrett. Now, another thing that is kind of quickly called out is the man that's carrying sticks on his back, which is a painting that's somewhat affiliated with Mr. Jimmy Page in this album. Now, I'm going to say it's the Ten of Wands. It's almost, I would say, impossible to miss that the Ten of Wands looks so much like this painting that's associated with the album that you would have to assume that it's included for a reason. So what possibly could be tied to the Ten of Wands? Now, if I'll read it to you. A card of many significances, and some of the readings cannot be harmonized. In other words, they're not all going to be applicable. I'll set aside connections, set aside that which connects it with honor and good faith, oppression, but also fortune, gain, any kind of success of these things. It is also a card of false seeming and disguise. The place which the figure is approaching may suffer from the rods that he carries. And there's a question about Nine of Swords following. So again, we have very similar ideas that are tied to the initial card of the Hermit, which is that this is oppression, success, false seeming, and disguise. Okay, so there's false seeming and disguise. That ties in with treason from the Hermit. And also that the place the figure is approaching may suffer from the rods he's carrying. In other words, this person could be carrying a load of arrows or something like that. Now, of course, arrows, wands are often associated with arrows in the tarot deck. Arrows are often associated with love. So the weight of 10 complete, 10 is often referred to as a complete number. The completion of a love or a love story. And this, we will find, is constantly being kind of relayed within this album. Now, I would like to point out there that there's an aspect of this of prudence, treason, roguery, and false seeming and disguise, which you have to wonder, why are those aspects being relayed? And part of the reason, I would say, is that it is possible that Mr. Barrett has contributed in some fashion to the lyrics of this album. And of course, if he did so, there may be reasons why he would want to hide that. First off is he may have been under contract, and moonlighting may have been quite frowned upon, or may have put his other assets at risk. Perhaps he could have been removed, etc. Or perhaps people would have picked up on the fact that he maybe was moonlighting. Another reason that Mr. Barrett perhaps could be contributing, but contributing anonymously to this album, is that last bit about the town that these were being carried to may suffer. So if we find in this breakdown songs that perhaps may cause suffering to another person or another group of people, it might explain why you would want to hide the source, because in that way you can protect the object and still relay the message honestly and have a form of artistic truth to the song, if that makes sense. So let's go ahead then, and I suppose that's pretty much it for the for those two symbols. The other thing that I want to discuss really quickly, and I'm not exactly sure when I'll do that. Maybe I'll come back to that. Let's come back to that one, okay? And that's going to be about the runes or the symbols that are used on the album. So we'll come back to that one later. What I'd like to do now is tell you a story, I suppose, about a very specific song that Mr. Barrett wrote. And I want to give you a little bit of background on this story. Now, this song is called Dominos. And the reason that it's an interesting song is something that may surprise you. So let's look through the lyrics. If you would pull them up, pull up the lyrics to Dominos by Syd Barrett and take a look. Okay? And we're going to discuss some things about the song. Now, I'm not going to get overly into the different aspects of this song. It was released in 1970, and I believe that the Led Zeppelin IV album was released in 1971. I'm not entirely certain exactly. I believe it was recorded from December of 70 through February of 71 and was released thereafter. So this, of course, comes after Mr. Barrett releasing his song Dominos. Let's look at the lyrics real quick. This predates Led Zeppelin IV. There's a mention of idea someday, and there's tears and dreams mentioned, so let's make a note of that. Tears and dreams, and of course, those words are somewhat related in structure. There's a mention of wanting to see your proof, and life that comes of no harm. I have no idea what that means, by the way, that when he says life comes of no harm. And the day goes by, and they're playing dominoes. There's a day that's dark and warm, and life without harm, etc. And then the next bit says fireworks, heat, someday, hold a shell, stick or play. I have no idea what hold a shell, a stick or play. There's mention of a lark, and a lark, of course, is an interesting bird because it's so often referred to by poets, and that's because of the interesting sound that a lark can make. It's quite a beautiful song. So there's a bird reference right there. Again, that's been repeatedly done by Barrett. There's a mention of losing when the mind's astray. Something about pretty hair, stretch out your hand. And the song just kind of meanders. It doesn't really seem to have a chorus, just a set of verses about being together with someone. Now, this song doesn't really seem like a whole lot, I have to admit. And when you listen to it, there's not a whole lot going on. I will relay a story to you about this song. And again, I will relay you or send you back to Julian Palacios' book on page 372, Dark Globe. On page 372, while David Gilmour relays that while they were recording this song, they were having a lot of trouble fitting the guitar to the song. At which point, Mr. Barrett said, let's play the guitar backwards, the guitar portion first, and then they set it up, they ran the guitar portion backwards, and it perfectly fit the song. And that is incredibly odd or fortuitous, depending upon your belief. Now, you could just say that's, a mistake, and perhaps that, it's just a coincidence. Or you could say, maybe that was done on purpose, which would be an indicator that Mr. Barrett had actually planned on playing his guitar backwards and throwing everybody off as maybe kind of a joke, or maybe as a display of his ability. And of course, people that are incredibly intelligent love nothing more than showing you how capable they are. So you have to wonder if he did that on purpose. But at any rate, it does show that he was capable of possibly doing things backwards. All right? At least with guitar. So let's keep that in mind. So since we've run through Dominos kind of as an intro of some kind, what I'd like to do is go ahead now, and I want to start running through some of the basic ideas of the songs, and two of the songs I really want to break down, and the rest of them I'm just going to kind of go through really quickly. So let's go from beginning to end, and let's discuss quite a bit of the songs from the album Led Zeppelin IV. Now the first one is, of course, Black Dog. Now, I'm not even going to go anywhere. I'm just going to point to the title Black Dog. Now it's real easy. Apparently there's a rumor or something that there was a black dog around Headley Grange or something while the band was recording. But there's a little bit more to the idea of a black dog. A little bit more. I will point you to a book. And this book is called A Treasury of Irish Myth, Legend, and Folklore. Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry, edited by W.B. Yeats, and you may recognize the name Yeats. Now, there are a number of things that Mr. Yeats are called out in this book. Let me give you some of the information on the book. I just gave you the title. Let me give you a little bit more, okay? Gramercy Books, New York. Let me see. Where's the copyright on this thing? 1986, Crown Publishers, Inc. And it was published previous to that by another group, but that's the version that I have. So the page numbers may be off a little bit on your page numbers. Now on page 81, they discuss the idea of a black dog, which is, of course, more than just a black dog. There are a lot of British legends about black dogs, and quite noticeably they are tied to, of course, the afterlife. And this is kind of called out in this paragraph where they discuss the nature of a black dog, which is perhaps a puka or other type of a spirit. And quite often it is tied to the underworld, and a dog like Cerberus. There are numerous kind of relational ideas between black dogs and the underworld or death. Of course, by the color black, which we've already discussed, is tied to the earth. On page 230 is a illustration of the devil with his hounds. I'll just kind of give a picture of the hounds. And I'd like to kind of point out that the faces of the hounds here look somewhat similar to the faces in the stadium of the people in Mr. Barrett's painting that we call The Boy and the Lion, which is in my Peeling Syd Barrett series if you want to check that out. But the faces look kind of similar. They're leering at a person that's praying, and they have the same kind of feel as that painting. Now, the idea of a black dog, of course, could be tied to the idea of a spirit or visiting the spirit realm. And I suppose that a person could say, you know, if this actually ties in with the idea of the spirit world or the underworld of some kind, why is it being relayed at the very beginning of this album? I don't really know. I mean, that connection may just be simply random. It might not have anything to do with what was intended. It's also possible that it's perhaps a reference to taking a trip to another place, to a dream world. We've discussed the nature of the card, the moon, and perhaps this is the idea that we're moving past or moving with a guardian. Now, this black dog can be positive or negative. Of course, it's a dog, so in many ways, dogs are positive. They are often considered to be guides to people, assistants on a hunt, or perhaps even guardians of humans. So in many ways, dogs can be positive, and there are quite a few positive stories about black dogs in British legends as well. So perhaps this song is titled this because it is the beginning of kind of a journey to the underworld of thought or dream or something along those lines, and that's the reason why it's titled Black Dog. I don't know, just throwing that idea out there. Now this book, I want to get back to the book really quick, has a lot of really cool and interesting stories. If you're into Irish stories, and you may be, I think you'll enjoy this book. On that same page of 81 is a discussion of the fairy mistress. I don't know how to say this, Leon and she, the fairy mistress. And she is in many ways kind of a, I guess maybe a white lady, a fairy lady, a forest lady, a Gaelic muse that gives inspiration and can be positive or negative, depending upon the relation of the person that they're interacting with. There also is a breakdown of the various fairy creatures and the importance of things like Midsummer's Eve and May Eve and November Eve on page 2. There's a discussion of those and what the chief occupations of the various fairies was, such as feasting, fighting, making love, and playing beautiful music. That's what they're interested in. So we've already discussed quite a bit of the background of fairy lore with Mr. Barrett, and perhaps that's what's kind of going on here with the discussion about a black dog. Kind of gone off track a little bit there, but let's keep going. Now the actual lyrics for this, let's go ahead and look at them. They're quite proactive lyrics. So like the way someone moves, like the way she moves, I'm gonna make her sweat and groove. I'm assuming with the music that's being played, although of course that's an assumption, and there is kind of a subtle kind of a sexual undertone to the song, of course. The way that she shakes that thing can make you burn and sting, etc. Can't keep a wave, watch your honey drip. Now these lyrics are all very direct. They're, I guess, a bit poetic, but I have to admit that they don't really show a whole lot to me that is overly poetic. So let's keep going. They do the oh yeah, and then gotta roll, can't stand still, flamin' heart, eyes that shine burnin' red. What an interesting lyric that is, that someone's eyes are shining red and that they have dreams of that person through their head. That obviously could be a reference to, it's hard to say if he's saying that their eyes are shining or that his eyes are shining burning red. But the color red in a person's eyes is, of course, quite often associated with, I don't know how to put it nicely, but possession, I suppose you could say. So why they are saying that, I don't really know. But there's a reference to red, and we've already discussed in our Peeling Syd Barrett, King of Paint, the idea of connection to red. So there's a connection to this, again, to the color red. And in that breakdown, we discussed some of the possible reasons why Mr. Barrett may be calling out the color red repeatedly. So if you're interested in that, you can kind of go check it out. But that does seem to be kind of a color that he calls out in various ways, including scarlet or red or pink, etc. Let's keep going. There's an interesting verse here. Didn't take too long before I found out what people mean by down and out. What does that mean? Who would write such a lyric? Is Jimmy Page on Down and Out? I mean, to my knowledge, he wasn't. I don't know that Robert Plant was either. He kind of had a pretty stable life. Spent my money, took my car, telling her friends she's going to be a star. Now, I don't know that Jimmy Page and Robert Plant had a negative relationship like that. But you can read through Mr. Barrett's history and you can see that that kind of ties in with some of the things that he discusses or he perhaps had gone through. That's just on a purely autobiographical level. It's difficult to know if that's being actually relayed purely autobiographically, but of course it's easy to do that when you're writing. Much easier than completely making up a story. And there's a bit about big-legged women don't have souls. and the idea that he needs a woman to hold his hand and won't tell no lies and will make him a happy man. Now, the reason that line is interesting, of course, is because Mr. Barrett did a song with the lyric in it, "I Never Lied to You," which we also have discussed in the Peeling Syd Barrett. So the expectation, of course, is that she won't be telling lies and I won't be telling lies, etc. So that's a pretty quick breakdown of that song and some of the reasons why it may be perhaps influenced by Mr. Barrett. I'll just call out the things in there that are kind of more similar to me, in my mind, to Mr. Barrett's life than the life of Jimmy Page or Robert Plant, as far as I know. I could be wrong, but there is, of course, the lyric or the song "I Never Lied to You," which was written by Mr. Barrett, and the end of the second verse, he says quite simply, says, "To see you looking too, but I know this, I know I never lied to you." So it's unstated who that's to, and it's unstated really which specific relationship this is about, but that right there is a lyric that's written by Mr. Barrett, and we did discuss that in the Peeling Syd Barrett series. That does seem to have an undercurrent or a theme to it that does kind of line up with Mr. Barrett's life, or at least one of his songs. Now, the next song is called "Rock and Roll," and let's take a look at that really quick. Again, I'll just ask a few questions, and I won't go into the song too much. If you can, call up the lyrics and we'll discuss them. The very first line is, "It's been a long time since I rock and rolled." Really? Why would it be a long time since Robert Plant or Jimmy Page rock and rolled? They rock and rolled all the way through the 60s and the early 70s. So why has it been a long time since they've rock and rolled? What an interesting intro line. I know it's been a long time since Mr. Barrett rock and rolled. Not only was he making solo albums quietly, but his solo albums were not really what I would call rock and roll albums. They're more like folk albums. Specifically, most of the songs that are about relationships and love. So I know it's been a long time since Mr. Barrett's rock and rolled. The next line is quite interesting because it says, "It's been a long time since I did the stroll." So there's a rhyme with roll and stroll. Oh, what a droll combination. But I will point out that the stroll appears to be a reference to kind of dancing and grooving. And that's been used before in Mr. Barrett's lyrics. Specifically, she don't do the stroll, but well, she don't do it right. And I'll put the song up here that lyric comes from. So there's another specific word use that ties in with one of Mr. Barrett's lyrics. Anyway, let's keep going. Been a long time, lonely, lonely, lonely time. I don't know how many of Mr. Barrett's songs discuss him being lonely. Of course, he's not the only person in the world that's lonely, and I'm sure Page and Plant have had periods of loneliness as well. But I know Mr. Barrett was quite specifically doing lonely songs in the 70s, the early 70s. Can't count the tears of a life with no love. Carry me back where I come from. Interesting. So here's the reference then. In the third, I'm going to say the third verse where it says, "Seems so long since we walked in the moonlight. Making vows can't just work right." Who made vows in the moonlight? I don't know. But that really does sound quite a bit like the song Julia Dream. And it does kind of sound like something that may have been going on with these kind of unrequited love songs that Mr. Barrett was putting together. I don't know that Mr. Plant and Mr. Page, perhaps they had some kind of unrequited love in their history. I don't know. I don't really get that feel from the book. that I read about by Miss Pamela DeBars about Jimmy Page. I can't speak to Robert Plant personally. I haven't read very much about him. I know that he was married pretty young and that it had some problems, including the death of one of his, I believe it's his oldest son. But I don't believe that was until later, in 75 or 77. So I don't know necessarily that Mr. Plant had gone through something that was that painful at this point in time. So at any rate, that's it for rock and roll. Again, a fairly simple song, very straightforward, but a rock and roll song. And we also know, of course, that from songs like Astronomy Domine and Lucifer Sam, I have to admit that Mr. Barrett was pretty good at doing up-tempo rock songs. He just didn't apparently really want to do them for his solo albums for some reason. So let's go ahead then and move to the next song, which is the Battle of Evermore. And this one's really, really long, so I don't want to go through the whole thing. I'll just point to lyrics that perhaps kind of deal with maybe some things that Mr. Barrett, or tendencies that we've already called out in our Peeling Syd Barrett series that may be applicable. So there's a mention of Queen of Light taking a bow, Prince of Peace embracing the gloom and walking the night alone. That's an interesting bit because for many people the Prince of Peace, of course, is kind of a reference to a Christ figure. We've thoroughly discussed that possibility in Mr. Barrett's work, and you can check that out in our Peeling Syd Barrett King of Paint episode if you like. And Walking the Night Alone. Okay. Now the Queen of Light, I'll just point out really quickly. I don't know exactly what's represented. We've already discussed the idea of the royal reference in Mr. Barrett's music, so anytime I hear king, queen, or prince in this case, I really have to wonder, who's putting that together, because I know that Mr. Barrett has repeatedly used those kinds of royal references. Now, in our previous book on the myth, legends, and folklore of Ireland, on page 81 is also a discussion of the fairy mistress. And of course, there's also discussion of things like banshees. And I guess you could call them white ladies. And the kind of Queen of Light or the White Lady legend of the British Isles. You can read about that on your own if you like. But I'll leave you to do so. Now the next bit. Dance, darken night, sing into the morning light. Oh, man. Now, I know that there was a concert that Mr. Barrett did where he was singing into the morning light, and I'll give a reference to that. It was one of the very, very big, probably the most important concert that Mr. Barrett ever played at with Pink Floyd, which was, I believe, Games for May, and I believe he was playing Until the Morning Light. At any rate, why is the Dark Lord riding in force of them tonight? I don't know, but that kind of, I'm not entirely certain what the Dark Lord could be a reference to. Of course, we've already discussed the idea of the color black and darkness being tied to Saturn. You can go check out our Peeling Syd Barrett, A Painting Black episode if you like, where we discuss the nature of the color black and Chronos, or time, and Saturn, and how all those things tie together. Perhaps that's what's being referenced here. I'm not entirely certain. I mentioned to throw down, plow and hoe. Waiting for the Eastern Glow. These are all I dance in the dark of night, but sing to the morning light. Now, I'm assuming that the morning light is, of course, the morning sun, but I just want to point out that morning also could be the morning star. So I don't know, perhaps that's what's being referenced there. There is a reference again to the color red. The apples turn to brown and black. The tyrant's face is red. Now, we've already discussed the nature of red being tied to earthly power. Mortals never know. So there's a reference here. The drums shake the castle wall. Ring wraiths ride in black, right on. So there, right there is a Tolkien reference. We've already heard Tolkien referenced in Misty Riders. That's from Matilda Mother, which was a previous Syd Barrett song, of course. So there's a Tolkien reference. And, of course, there are other Tolkien references in Led Zeppelin music as well. Mr. Barrett doesn't own the copyright on referencing Tolkien music, but it is interesting that they're both quoting Tolkien quite frequently. And, of course, Led Zeppelin also referenced Tolkien on an earlier song, Ramble On. So there's that bit. There's a reference to magic runes that are written in gold, and trying to bring balance back. And Clouds of Blue. Again, there's another lyric, Clouds of Blue, that is specifically used by Mr. Barrett. Of course, Clouds of Blue, he doesn't have a copyright on that. But that's from the song Flaming, Alone in the Clouds All Blue. The dragon of darkness and the sunlight blinds his eyes. And, of course, sunlight blinding eyes is a lyric from... I don't remember if it's Cirrus Minor or if it's Cymbeline, where he says something but moonlight made her blind every time. I'll put the lyric up on the screen and I'll compare it with this lyric, the sunlight blinds his eyes. So there's another lyric that is used from the More album that ties in with this song. So that's pretty much it. There's a number of correlations there to previous combinations of words and ideas that Mr. Barrett had used in his music and Pink Floyd had used in their music from the album More. Okay, so that's it for the Battle of Evermore. Let's go ahead then and tackle the big one. Okay, let's tackle the big one. This is going to be bad. Okay, this is going to take a while. So I want you to consider a number of things. Now, first, one of the things that you might be wondering is, why am I going through all this trouble? I forgot something. So I'll go back to and mention this. Now, this is from Julian Palacios' book. On page 237, from See Emily Play discussion, he specifically discusses that Mr. Barrett relayed a dream. He woke up in a field and had a dream or saw a lady coming out of the forest walking to him. And that was kind of a part of the background of the story of See Emily Play. What you want to take from that, I don't know, but there's a Lady of the Forest there, a Lady of the Forest reference. Perhaps that's kind of an ideal woman or an ideal lady or a fairy lady, etc. And that is relayed directly from Mr. Barrett, and I believe in an interview of some kind. Now, one of the things you may be wondering kind of is, why am I going through all this trouble to put this together? Why do I think that it's worth kind of looking at? And hopefully now you've got a little bit of a taste of some of the things that might be tied to Mr. Barrett. Now, one of the things that I haven't discussed is kind of what was going on with Led Zeppelin. So first off, let's just kind of point out that, in my opinion, the idea that you have these three amazing musicians coming together and putting together this group by accident is absurd. Let me say that again. The idea that you have Jimmy Page, John Bonham, and Robert Plant coming together and forming this super group, and they didn't know what they had, or it just happened by luck, is absurd. This band obviously kind of would have known early on, and whoever kind of put together this group, and apparently, a lot of it ties in with Jimmy Page. I don't know the entire history of Led Zeppelin being put together. My understanding, I think, was that Bonham and Plant were already playing together in some fashion. I don't know. But there certainly was an industry that was helping put together bands and helping put together music. We've also discussed in our Peeling Syd Barrett episode, which may have been in the A Painting Black episode, about the Beatles giving a song which they kind of considered to be a throwaway song, which was, I believe, titled I Want to Be Your Man, which they gave to the Rolling Stones. So there is already a kind of an industry, a sub-industry kind of a method of sharing music to some degree, perhaps because other people can play it better than you, or perhaps because it's appropriate to them. And that's kind of called out in the book about the Beatles. And I'll give you the information for that here, for that book. But if you want to get the specifics for that story, you can go back and check out that Peeling Syd Barrett series. So where exactly am I going with that? Well, where I'm going is this specific song, Stairway to Heaven. So there's a whole lot in this song, and I guess let's just kind of go ahead and dive into it, I guess. This is going to be brutal. Now, this song is a 3-part song, and the intro is really, of course, the very iconic guitar opening that got Led Zeppelin kind of into a lot of trouble with the band Spirit and their song Taurus, which has a very similar opening, and I believe that that band actually had been touring with Led Zeppelin for a while. So perhaps Mr. Page took aspects of that song and then formed the intro to Stairway to Heaven. I don't know. They had a big lawsuit about all this, and this was kind of, I guess you could say, worked out in some fashion. Now, one of the reasons why I guess I have concerns is because I believe there's an article that was posted by the Washington Post where they specifically call out the idea that initially the story was this was written in Broniar, and it was apparently changed. That story was changed during the course of that trial, and was changed to Headley Grange. So if perhaps recollections are just off, I don't know. But let's consider the possibility that perhaps the lyrics, or the entirety of the lyrics, wasn't done at one point in time, that perhaps it was put together somewhere else by whoever and was adapted over time. Who knows what the input of Mr. Robert Plant was. But let's read through these real quick and let's see what we've got. Okay? So start with the beginning of the song. There's a lady that's sure that everything that glitters is gold. Now, of course, what that could mean, I don't know entirely, but the next line helps define it, that she's buying a stairway to heaven. So, in other words, she's trying to utilize material possessions to ascend to some form of spiritual enlightenment, which is not only judgmental, but is also misogynistic. And I'm not saying that it's right or wrong. I'm just saying that it's judgmental and it's misogynistic. And that the person that's being judged is a woman. Who cares? A lot of people believe that they're going to buy a stairway to heaven. Why would you write a song about that? Well, perhaps it's just a discussion about some random person, but you have to think, if you're going to write an entire song about this person, it's possibly because that person had an effect on you or had an effect on your life. Or perhaps, you're just calling it out. But as we've mentioned in our Peeling Syd Barrett series, there was there was a relation with Mr. Barrett that perhaps moved on from him, that chose to do so for being with a let's say a more well-off or more stable relationship, which is understandable, especially if someone like Mr. Barrett is behaving incredibly erratically. That could be kind of a turnoff to a lot of people. So, at any rate, so there's a mention of stores being closed, and then believing that with a word they can get what they want. There's a sign on the wall, and sometimes words have two meanings. I don't know. Now there's a mention of a tree by the brook and a songbird who sings. We've heard this lyric before from Grantchester Meadows. That almost exact same line is called out in Grantchester Meadows, and I'll kind of put it up on the screen as a comparison. And of course, Grantchester Meadows is not attributed to Mr. Barrett. It is attributed to, I believe, Roger Waters of Pink Floyd. There's a mention of a feeling when you look to the west and the spirit is crying for leaving. Well, I don't know entirely what that is. That could just be a breakdown to the idea of America being in the west, or that the sun sets in the west. But I will point out that in Mr. Barrett's life, he did travel to the west, and in our Peeling Syd Barrett series, Apples and Oranges, we discussed the idea that perhaps he may have recognized that a relationship was ending during that tour. And that may be part of the reason why he was deliberately staring at the screen and choosing to sing the song Apples and Oranges. And the nature of that song, Apples and Oranges. Just want to throw that out. Rings of smoke through the trees kind of makes you think perhaps that may be a discussion of a nuclear or atomic war. And the voices who stand looking. The next verse discusses that if it's whispered soon, we may call the tune, and the piper will lead us to, who's the piper? Well, in pop reference, of course, in the United States, anytime I hear the term Joker from the 60s, I know immediately who they're discussing. They're discussing Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan was, I guess you could say, widely referred to as the Joker. So who's the piper? Well, it could just be a reference to any piper, I suppose, or some legendary piper, or a Pied Piper. But then again, couldn't this also be a reference to Mr. Barrett himself? The piper at the gates of dawn? Is it perhaps a reference to him leading people to reason in some way? Is that a plan? Is that Mr. Barrett's plan? Is that even a reference that's associated with Mr. Barrett? I don't know. You decide. So the next bit here, after it makes me wonder, this is an important, here's a very important verse, let's call it. A bustle in your hedgerow, don't be alarmed now. Spring clean for the May Queen. Now, I believe this is one of the parts that people believe, if you play backwards, etc., can relay some form of a message that they believe relays some kind of, I don't know, whatever message they want to believe it's stating. Again, this is all lyrically done, so if you believe that, we have already proven in this video that Mr. Barrett was more than capable of thinking in terms backwards, and he could have done something like put in a message that's backwards. If you want to believe Robert Plant is capable of doing that because you believe that that's actually in there, I guess I'll defer to your judgment. You can believe that if you want, but I will point out that when Mr. Barrett went solo, his songs and lyrics became quite complicated and quite involved and interesting. When Mr. Plant went solo, he did songs like Big Log. And if you want to go look up the lyrics to Big Log, feel free to do so. But they are not relaying any of this imagery and complexity that I'm seeing in these other songs. Now, perhaps that's just a different stage in his life, and he wanted to express, more simple rock and roll. I don't know. All I know is that the later solo music that I have examined from Robert Plant doesn't really relay any of the complexity that's being relayed in these songs. And I will also point out that if I want to point you to a song that we can be fairly certain that Mr. Plant wrote, it's the song All My Love. And the reason for that is, of course, that is an incredibly personal song. And it's relayed to an incredibly personal event. And nobody, which was the death of his son, nobody would have wanted to touch that song. That would have been him discussing something incredibly personal to him, if you understand the nature of that song and the nature of Robert Plant. And I will point out that it is an extremely poignant song, and it delivers a real sense of pain and suffering. But of course, that was written later after an event of pain and suffering. And I will also point out that that song is a very simple song. This is not a simple song. And I know someone who's capable of writing very complex songs. That's Mr. Barrett. So let's look through here. A bustle in your hedgerow. Don't be alarmed now. A spring clean for the May Queen. Okay, so there's a May reference, which is direct from See Emily Play, and a Queen reference, which we've seen Syd Barrett do constantly. Now, why would this possibly be alarming, that there's a spring clean for a May Queen? Well, go ahead and watch our King of Paint episode from Peeling Syd Barrett, and you'll have some form of an idea. There may have been a kind of a bad experience between people that is, I guess you could call a spring cleaning prior to a May Queen. There's a reference to two paths you can go by, and there's still time to change the road you're on. Of course, that is a very common reference. We've heard that before. The road is very high, etc., and it's tied to the moon card. And here's a message, of course, that it's not too late. You can change the road you're on. Well, why would Jimmy Page or Robert Plant be telling someone they can change the road they're on? Well, I don't really know. They seem to have had the type of life with the people that they wanted to have when they wanted to have it with them. But I know that Mr. Barrett lost someone that he may not have wanted to lose. And so this may be delivered. And we've specifically called out in the Shy Star, which I'll link that as well. But you can check the verse just before the verse of Goldenhair in chamber music by Ulysses, that quite specifically Mr. Barrett has said that in Goldenhair, this love song that's tied to Barrett, and it's tied to not Ulysses, sorry. The name is going to avoid, I'm not going to be able to think of the name right now. But chamber music, that verse just before it may be an indicator of what was going on, which was that, and that verse, which I wrote a song for, and you can check out that song about the shy star going forth in heaven, and how that is related to, or questioning, who is writing these songs. All right, so let's keep going. The piper is calling you to join him. Can you hear the winds blow? And your stairway is on the whispering wind. Okay, so that ends kind of the second portion of the song, and I think you can see there's quite a few correlations that you could draw directly to some of Mr. Barrett's work, like the song Goldenhair and the chamber music reference. So the next bit of the song is very fast. Wind down the road, shadows taller than our soul. I don't know what that would mean, but perhaps that's a reference, of course, that it is undesirable to have your shadow longer than your soul. You would like your soul to be the larger aspect of who you are and not necessarily your shadow. What that means, I don't know. But given the context of the song, of course, a shadow in a Jungian sense would be kind of the negative aspects of a person's personality. So in other words, kind of our negative sides taking over and running things instead of our soul. There's a reference to the lady walking in white light and showing that everything still turns to gold. That may, of course, be a reference to an ideal lady or an ideal woman who can still have everything beautiful in a soul turn to gold. The last bit about listening hard and the tune will come to you at last. Or in other words, if you pay attention to the song or pay attention to the music, then everything will be one, everything will be good. And that's what it is, to rock and not to roll. What's meant by that, I don't entirely know. And then buying a Stairway to Heaven. Now, this is quite clearly a song of reproach. And I would just like to point back to our symbol from before, that the message may be painful to the place where it's being delivered. And I think you can see from this interpretation why that may be the case. Because it may be calling out someone that is deeply loved, which is a difficult thing to do. Of course, a lot of people have to do something like that. They're forced to deal with the pain of the realization that the person that they love, which is not always chosen, by the way. Sometimes it just kind of happens, especially in adolescence. When people aren't really thinking about these things very well, they just kind of fall into stuff, and then they realize too late, perhaps, that there's a flaw, a fatal flaw to the relationship, and they end up suffering because of it. So perhaps that's kind of what's going on. And because if you are of the mind that Mr. Barrett had some hand in this, you can see why he would want to remain anonymous. Because the person that's involved may recognize him talking to them, which would be somewhat hurtful, and saying that they're materialistic above spiritually driven, which is kind of a harsh thing to say to somebody, although it might be true. Okay, that's pretty much it for Stairway to Heaven. Let's go on to the next song, which is, Misty Mountain Hop. Now, I just want to call out first the name. We know already Mr. Barrett did Birdie Hop. He recorded that early in the 70s, I believe. It wasn't released until much later. And you kind of have to wonder if there's a reason for that. Okay, I forgot to do something again. There's so much in this, so it's really hard to kind of call out. So I'll call it out now. Let's look at the lyrics for a Syd Barrett song, okay, and it's called Maisie. Now this song Maisie was released in 1970, and it's a very I don't know, it's kind of a goofy song, and if you listen to it, it doesn't really sound like there's a whole lot going on. So it may have a very, very simple message. So let's take a look at it and think about the lyrics really quick. Repeatedly stating Maisie, and then bad luck and bride of a bull. Mentioned that someone strode out to meet Maisie in the evening light. A luminous grin put her in a spin. Maisie lay in the hall with diamonds and emeralds. Bad luck, bride of a bull. Emeralds, diamond brooch, beyond reproach. Bad luck, bride of a bull. Strolled out to meet Daisy in the evening light. So, of course, let's... Very, very simple and very obtuse and difficult to understand. But I want to make a few connections here. Here again is a reference to diamonds and emeralds, in other words, riches. The bride of a bull. Why would someone be the bride of a bull? I don't totally know, but of course another word for bull is of course Taurus. We just did Stairway to Heaven, and you have to wonder if because of the tie to the song Taurus, is this in some way tied to that song? And I will point out the name Maisie, which has the same sounds as Jimmy. So the SI, or the S sound, Maisie, G, or she, or G, J, and May. So Jimmy is inverted sounds of Maisie. So is this a joke in some way? Making fun of Jimmy for being the bride of a bull? I don't know. There is a painting, of course, by Picasso. I don't know the name of it, which has to do with the judgment of Picasso of himself for his, let's say, his bullish kind of inclinations. Now, for Picasso, the bull represented kind of male sexual drive, I suppose you could say, prowess, and perhaps the negative aspect of that, which is just this uncontrollable aspect to love and lust. And that's kind of captured in that, where there's the two ladies overhead that are kind of judging what he's doing. And of course, Picasso was kind of torn between two women at the time. So perhaps he's just referencing that Picasso painting. But I would like to point out that this is discussing the Bride of a Bull, which of course could be a reference to Taurus, and Meiji, which could be a reference to, or a nickname, which Mr. Barrett was kind of keen on doing for Jimmy. Jimmy, perhaps Jimmy Page. You decide. Maybe that one's a bit too far for you to follow, but who knows. So let's go ahead then. Let's jump back into Misty Mountain Hop. Now we know that Mr. Barrett, of course, did Birdie Hop. So here's another kind of a hop, and I want you to think critically now. Who could be writing this song? And I'm wondering who could be writing this song. Right? From Jug Band Blues. That's the lyric. I'm wondering who could be writing this song. So Misty Mountain Hop, of course, Misty Mountain again. There's the Misty Mountain reference, the Tolkien reference, which both Zeppelin and Syd Barrett have done previously. Walking in the park, what do you think I saw? There were crowds of people with flowers in their hair, or in other words, flower children, sitting on the grass. Hey boy, do you want to score? Okay, so let's ask a few questions. If this is directly autobiographical, which it may be, who would say to Jimmy Page or Robert Plant, hey boy, do you want to score? I don't even know if they could do that. I think they would be mobbed by fans and people all the time. They're instantly recognizable at this point in time. But I know someone who's not entirely recognizable, and that's Syd Barrett. So he very well could be walking around, going to parks and things, and he kind of would have disappeared from the scene. I don't know that he would have been recognized by very many people. And a reference, of course, that, let's continue on. You know how it is. I don't know what time it was, so I asked if I could stay a while. And then all of a sudden, it's dark, and this person was really out of their mind. Why would they be out of their mind? I don't know. A lot of people have said Mr. Barrett would utilize psychedelics at this point in time. Perhaps he could have been out of his mind. I don't know. Jimmy Page and Robert Plant may have been into that as well. Perhaps they would have been out of their minds. A policeman steps up and says, everybody get in line. Well, you know, they asked to stay for tea and have some fun. That's a bit odd, isn't it? And then they said that his friends would drop by. So apparently at that point in time, the police have now recognized perhaps who is involved, or perhaps they just have decided that they don't necessarily want to be police and make everybody stand in line. I don't know. The next line is interesting. Why don't you take a good look at yourself and describe what you see? That's the exact same idea that's presented in the song Arnold Lane. The bit about see-through baby blue, he dug it. Looking in the mirror and seeing the see-through baby blue and digging it. Do you like what you see? And baby, baby, do you like it? Okay, The next bit is interesting as well. There you sit and spare like a book on a shelf rusting. That is a metaphor of a person to a book being on a shelf. Well, I've heard that as well. That is in the Pink Floyd song from More, Ibiza, I believe. Ibiza Bar, where there is a reference specifically to a book being on a shelf. Interesting as well, isn't it? You really don't care if they're coming. It's all a state of mind. If you go down the streets today, you better open your eyes, because people don't care. They really don't care which way the pressure lies. I'm going to read through most of this, okay? So I've decided that I'm going to pack my bags to the Misty Mountains and go there where the spirits fly. I really don't know. Now, this last verse is quite interesting because it seems to be relaying the idea of being completely put off by the flower children and deciding that you're just going to go pack your bags and leave for the Misty Mountains where the spirits are, over the hills, and go away from everybody else. Did perhaps Jimmy Page and Robert Plant, whoever wrote this song, I don't know. The songwriters are attributed to Jimmy Page, Robert Plant, and John Paul Jones. Perhaps they were feeling that as well. But it would appear that Syd Barrett felt that way. I'll point you back, of course, to the Hermit card that was part of the album and what it might imply. The idea of being by yourself, away from everyone else. Perhaps because you've fallen out of love with a movement. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the Misty Mountains. And let's go ahead on. I forgot to do the whole Syd score thing. I'll just put those up, I guess, for Misty Mountain Hop and for Stairway to Heaven. And I'll refer back to that. I've done that before with other Did Syd things, so I'm just going to do Syd scores for those two, and I won't call it out. During the course of this video, I'll just put it up on the screen. Sorry. I guess the last two songs we'll look at really quickly, which is Going to California. So let's look at that. Going to California. Spent my days with a woman unkind. I don't know if, again, there's unrequited love stated. Smoke stuff, drink all their wine. Now, I don't know when Zeppelin toured the United States. I don't totally know. But the idea that they're going to California with an aching in their heart, why would they be going to California with an aching in their heart? Perhaps there is something going on in the... Now, both Jimmy Page and Robert Plant are also notoriously, let's say, private in their discussions about their personal lives, which is totally understandable. But again, I'll just point out that during the America tour that went through California, Mr. Barrett almost certainly had an aching in his heart. And someone told him that there's a girl out there with love in her eyes and flowers in her hair. So perhaps did he go to America thinking that he would find these flower children or a flower children woman of some kind to a kind of ease the pain that was in his heart? I don't know. Going on a jet plane, not all the same. The sea was red and the sky was gray. Which seems to be an inversion, of course, of Jug Band Blues, where the sea is green. Why the sky is gray, I don't know. There's a mention of the children of the sun. We've already mentioned sun references before. I can't point to an exact lyric that ties in the children of the sun, so I'll just leave that one. There's a mention in the next verse about meet you up where the path runs straight and high. Of course, I believe that's called out in Cymbeline, the song Cymbeline, the idea of a high, narrow path, and I'll kind of call that out. The next line is find a queen without a king, and she plays guitar and cries and sings. Now, I believe I read or heard somewhere that this song was about Joni Mitchell or something, as it was written by the guys from Led Zeppelin. Definitely possible. There's a reference to a white mare and a woman who's never ever been born, and a mountain of dreams. All very dreamy, all very psychedelic. Of course, Mr. Barrett doesn't have a copyright on that style. So I'm only going to point to things that are extremely similar to previous Pink Floyd or Syd Barrett lyrics, and that one I'll kind of give a pass other than the Queen King reference there. Okay. Now the last one I want to discuss is When the Levee Breaks. And of course, When the Levee Breaks, why it's chosen, I don't entirely know. But really cool. Of course, one of the most famous drum bits ever made is Bonham on this song. So if you've never heard this song, you really should check it out for that reason. Again, a mention of rain being down, the levee's going to break or the dam's going to burst because of all the rain. When the levee breaks, I'll have no place to stay. Talking about weeping and moaning, and a mountain man has to leave his home. Trying to find your way home, but you don't know which way to go, which sounds a lot like the lyric waiting and wishing for someone to show you the way, which I believe is from Dark Side of the Moon, which is a later album, but at any rate. Going down to Chicago, crying won't help, praying won't help, crying won't help, praying won't do you no good. Just when the levee breaks, you gotta move. And that's pretty much it. I mean, I believe this is an old standard. I don't know who did the original or that it was based on, but I believe this is an old blues song, and I'll try to put that title up on the screen for this discussion. But of course, you have to wonder again, who is thinking about the dam bursting because of all the rain and all the tears and all these things? Of course, Mr. Barrett did a song where he talks about sitting by a window and thinking about things, and it's just raining. And I can't remember the name of that song. I'll throw that up on the screen as well. It has the same feel, but the lyrics don't seem to be directly related. So, I guess the last thing that I want to kind of point out is the runes for the album, and one last thing from Mr. Barrett that may be related to Mr. Page. And I didn't call this out previously, so perhaps now is a good time to do it. But there's just really a lot that's involved in this particular episode, so I feel sometimes like I'm getting way off topic, but whatever. So the last bit that I want to discuss is the idea of the song Two of a Kind. So Two of a Kind is a song by Mr. Barrett, and it was not released immediately. It was released much later. I'm not exactly sure when it was released. I want to say it wasn't released until the 80s, which is a little bit odd, and perhaps you will see the reason why. Now, again, we mentioned that there are kind of throwaway songs that are given to other bands. There are bands like the Monkees that are totally invented bands, so that whole idea now of this modern artist that's being developed by this corporate machine that's going to generate pop music and be presented and deliver whatever songs and messages that are written for them. That's not something totally new. You had a band like the Monkees. Whether or not they were eventually an actual valid band is not my point. My point is that they were at a point in time not really responsible for their music early in their career, and they were presented in a way as being in control of their music when they weren't necessarily. So let's look at a song like Two of a Kind, and let's ask kind of what's going on here in this song, and are there reasons why perhaps it wouldn't have been released until much later. I have a note here that says that it was released in 2001. I don't know. Okay, so the lyrics start out, open your eyes, don't be blind, we're two of a kind. I gotta say it, hope you don't mind, I love you, we're two of a kind. So why would someone mind that you're saying that you love them? Either because it's inappropriate, because they're in a relationship, or perhaps because, in a way, perhaps you have to wonder, is this between people that don't necessarily have the same feelings for one another? Or perhaps it's between two guys, and a lot of times, of course, love between two guys is not something that society is willing to accept. So let's go ahead then and keep going. Ask yourself, you'll find, go together, two of a kind. Don't protest, we're two of a kind. Now, the next bit is kind of, I guess you could say, a chorus. Knew it when I saw you, felt a little more, talked to you first. All my blues dispersed. Couldn't disguise, complete surprise. Feeling it too. In love with you, in love with you. Okay, so at that point, the author, Mr. Barrett, is stating that they were quite down and negative, and that all their negative feelings kind of went away when they finally met this person. So is it possible, of course, that they might not necessarily be referring to a love interest, but perhaps someone that they really respect, someone that is helping them, and that they are two of a kind? So I've already relayed the fact that Jimmy Page and Syd Barrett were born in very early January of different years, 44 and 46. I have to ask again if perhaps in some way they didn't have a form of friendship, or perhaps they had resigned themselves to working with one another. And of course, this album, Led Zeppelin IV, which was really their big comeback album, because Led Zeppelin III had been a bit of a letdown, and Led Zeppelin I and II had been so successful, and the third album came out and wasn't necessarily very well received critically or pop-wise, that perhaps Mr. Page would have felt a bit of pressure to really put together an awesome album. And this Led Zeppelin IV album is, in my opinion, their best album. It is a truly amazing album. And in particular, the song Stairway to Heaven is rightfully recognized as one of the greatest rock songs ever made. So is it possible that Mr. Barrett and Mr. Page would have worked together on this album? I don't know. You go ahead and decide. The last thing that I'm going to kind of throw at you, I've made a lot of correlations, and some of them are a little bit farther out than others. Of course, when I point to direct lyrics, I have two things. One is I forgot to mention Stairway to Heaven, of course, could be tied to a very specific... Oh, I keep missing things, you know? That's what happens when you got too many things to go through. So I have two things to kind of run through. Before we finish, two of a kind, I'll just point out that, of course, two of a kind is tied to Cockney slang. So Cockney rhyme slang, Markham and Wise ties in with flies. And I don't know if I'm saying the names correctly. Eric Markham and Ernie Wise. Morecambe and Wise. Markham and Wise. Much Love comedy team. And I've seen their show. It's pretty funny. That their show is called Two of a Kind. Now, Morecambe and Wise also refers to flies. Because of the connection to Morecambe and Wise. So this could be a double kind of a statement that's referring to flies again. And of course, as we mentioned in our Peeling Syd Barrett series, Mr. Jimmy Page is known to have played some with the band The Flies. So our previous discussion on Birdie Hop, you can go back and check Peeling Syd Barrett Birdie Hop. We discussed the flies and the possible meaning of the flies. Here's a song, Two of a Kind, which could be referring to the show, tied to Morecambe and Wise, which in Cockney rhyme slang is equated with the word flies. Could be a connection to Jimmy Page. Okay. So that one's kind of taken care of anyway. The last kind of thing that I'd like to point out is the idea of a stairway to heaven, and where could that possible beautiful imagery have come from? And of course, it may have come from William Blake, who did do a watercolor of Jacob's Ladder, which appears to be showing a stairway to the heavens and various people attempting to walk up and down a stairway, a spiral stairway to the heavens. So perhaps that's where that idea came from. I don't know. I know Mr. Barrett was quite into a lot of the ideas that are tied to Mr. Blake, and I don't know necessarily, if he, again, has a copyright on William Blake's ideas. A lot of people like William Blake. I'll just point out that that's a really cool image, and if you're an artist and you see that particular image, it'll stick with you, and perhaps it stuck with Mr. Barrett, and that's perhaps, if you believe that he actually put together the name of that, the title of that song, that would perhaps be a reason why. Of course, Mr. Jimmy Page and Robert Plant also were very well read. They may have also been aware of that, and that may also be where that idea came from. It could come from just about anything else. I believe there also was another song that was called Stairway to Heaven, which was an American song. I'll give the information for that as well. Quite a different song though, but the song title is the same. So one last thing then that I kind of want to discuss is the symbols that are used for the various band members. I'm not going to do all of them. I'm just going to do two. We've gone through a whole lot of stuff. You've been very patient. Thank you for your patience. And let's take a look at two of the symbols. Now the first one is a feather, which was attributed to Mr. Robert Plant. Now that feather, of course, is tied to birds, and birds are often tied to singers because of the songs. That breakdown we had of by Steve Markham, I believe, on Occult Symbolism specifically discusses this feather as a possible representation of the feather maat, a feather of maat, which has to do with the judging of a person's soul, which does fit particularly the song Stairway to Heaven, you have to admit. The other symbol that's mentioned is the Zoso symbol. It's called Zoso, and it is quite often tied to the and he does a much better breakdown of it than I'm going to. Okay, so if you're really into this stuff, I'll really suggest you go check out his video on occult symbolism. But it is an old representation. One of the possibilities is an old representation of Saturn, and of course Saturn is tied with the sign Capricorn for people that are born in early January. So there's one reason why it might be tied to Jimmy Page. I'll give you another though, just to finish up, that the Zoso symbol may also just graphically be interesting. The Z doesn't really look like a Z. If you look at it really closely, it looks a little bit odd. It almost looks like, if you turn it, it could be a capital L. Now, if you take the O's as simply dots, it could be L.S. or an abbreviation. What could that L.S. represent? I don't know. But I do know that Mr. Barrett wrote a song called Lucifer Sam, which would fit. And of course, we have previously mentioned, or I did anyway, in my breakdown Peeling Syd Barrett, that Lucifer Sam could of course be a song that has Mr. Barrett analyzing the left and right side of himself. Perhaps Lucifer Sam is a nickname he gave himself instead of Lucifer Syd, Lucifer Sam. But I'll just mention that Lucifer Sam, of course, could also be a nickname of his for Mr. Jimmy Page. And it could be tied right here in this symbol, the Zoso symbol. And I'll also point out, if you look at the Zoso symbol, away from the L, the shape of the rest of the symbol kind of looks like the face of a cat. Lucifer Sam, Siam, cat. I don't know. Could all just be a complete coincidence. Could be connections. Why don't you decide? At any rate, there's a lot of critical ideas, a lot of connections to consider. So I'll thank you for your time. We've had some new folks subscribe. Thank you very much for the new people that have subscribed. If you want to make comments, please feel free to make comments. If they're constructive, very much appreciated. If you want them called out, let me know. If you don't want them called out, let me know. And I'll try to answer things as much as I can. And I guess that's it for today. Thanks for your patience, and I'll talk to you later.